From gallery walls to private collections, is the art you're looking at even real? Welcome to the high-stakes world of forgeries and fakes. Welcome back to Big If True, Season 2. I'm Molly Thomas. If you've ever walked into an art gallery, you know a single piece can sell for a fortune. Talented swindlers are catching in on that by creating and distributing clever forgeries and fakes. It can hurt artists and ruin reputations, but the illicit art market is massive, with one Ontario story stealing the spotlight. Thick, bold lines and colorful, piercing eyes were staples of Norval Morrisseau's artistry in Northern Ontario. But the unique style that immortalized this Indigenous icon has appeared on counterfeit canvases, a scam highlighted in the documentary There Are No Fakes, which aired on TVO. Is this a real Morrisseau painting? What about this one? Or this? It's hard to tell. Police believe $100 million worth of forgeries were attributed to the late Morrisseau, commonly known as the Picasso of the North. Canadian police and even the Smithsonian call it the biggest art fraud in the world. And it's part of a growing trend. The global art crime market, which includes forgeries as well as theft and trafficking of precious pieces, is worth billions of dollars, with one conservative estimate claiming 50% of all art on the market is fake. Critics say the industry is unregulated, and the history of some pieces is difficult, even impossible to trace. That means fakes and forgeries are rampant. Take this prestigious New York gallery, for example. It's believed that between 1994 and 2011, it sold tens of millions of dollars worth of counterfeit paintings. That sparked a flurry of lawsuits. In another case, the Vancouver Art Gallery was duped, accidentally acquiring a collection of sketches believed to be created by Group of 7 artist J.E.H. MacDonald. Even governments aren't safe. Look at these Maud Lewis paintings, purchased with public funds back in 1982. It took 40 years for the Nova Scotia government to figure out they were fake. And when it comes to Morrisseau, this so-called masterpiece proudly hung in the Ontario legislature until it was seized by police in a recent investigation. Well, Ontario Provincial Police have confirmed to us that specific Morrisseau piece was a forgery. They and other departments have been looking into suspicious pieces credited to the late artist. Now, those investigations were inspired by Jamie Kastner's groundbreaking documentary, There Are No Fakes, which came out in 2019. Jamie, great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
You know, your doc really cracked open this case. So talk to me about the fallout.
It was quite unusual. The doc was finished in 2019, and in spring of 2023, the OPP held a joint press conference with Thunder Bay Police in Orillia, where they announced that an investigation, a 2.5-year investigation inspired by the doc, had resulted in 8 people being arrested, 40 charges being laid, and over 1,000 fake paintings seized.
I know some of these cases are still ongoing. At least one is in the sentencing phase, I believe. Is the Morrisseau affair resolved then? Like, are there more fakes out there, Jamie?
At the time we did the film in 2019, the estimate was that there were 3,000 fakes out there. At the time that the police announced the results of their investigation, they were estimating 6,000 fakes. And I believe it's gone upward from there.
Jamie, what does this do to Morrisseau's legacy?
For an artist of his stature, you know, he is Canada's greatest Indigenous artist, certainly one of our greatest artists, period, and one of the very few who invented his own school of painting. You know, for someone with that pedigree, his work ought to be worth a lot more. And one of the reasons the prices have been kept down is because there has been, long before this documentary came out, it was sort of an open secret, you might say, that there were a bunch of fake Morrisseaus flooding the market. So this, you know, while in a way it raises awareness about fakes and you could say it increases skepticism in potential buyers, in the short term. In the long term, it's a necessary first step to establishing what the real work is, and then theoretically that could rise to the market value it really deserves to have.
Right, if we can get all those fakes off the market and people can actually trust what they're buying. What does the
Right.
story then, Jamie, reveal to you about how vulnerable the art world is really to scams?
I was completely naive about this beforehand, I must say. I assumed that the art world was a sort of sophisticated, gentleman's club where people played by certain rules of civility. I think that what I've learned is that it's anything but that. When you take into consideration widespread fraud in pretty well every major gallery in the world, when you consider the spoils of World War II looting that also litters galleries, major galleries and institutions throughout the world. It's a bit of a cesspool.
I mean, you paint a real picture there by saying that word. Um, Jamie, is art forgery just a financial scam, or in your mind, is it also a form of misinformation?
Oh, it is. The title of my film is an ironic poke at misinformation. Art fraud is, of course, based on misinformation, and is a crime in that regard too, because it tampers with various ideas of what the truth is. It plays a notion of legal truth against a more objective truth. This is what the fraudsters were thriving from for decades, was this specific kind of misinformation. The onus in an art fraud case is not on the person who owns the art to prove that it's real. It's on the person making the accusation of fraudulence to prove that it's fake. So the whole issue of truth, it leaves, from a legal point of view, this leaves the notion, the whole field wide open to misinformation,
Hmm.
and people have exploited that shamelessly.
Who is the biggest victim here in your mind? Is it the collectors or the artists?
I mean, I will just say there's another part to the story of a bunch of crimes of abuse against Indigenous youth that were going on in and around the production of these fakes. So I would say, above all, above financial fraud, above cultural fraud and abuse, there was the physical abuse of a vulnerable group of youths,
Hmm.
that they are the prime victims connected with this crime, in my mind. I think unwitting collectors are victims. Obviously, collectors who are aware that they're trading in fakes are criminals, or by association at the very least. Um, the artist, of course, is also a victim. I felt that this was actually a real live case of colonialism that I happened upon in this story, in that there were a bunch of crooks, most of whom were white, who were benefiting from this kind of cultural defiling of the work of one of our greatest Indigenous artists, and surely that is a cultural crime too.
Hmm.
So I think there are many victims.
Uh, if someone out there has never ever bought a piece of fine art, why should they
Mhm.
care about this story and this topic, Jamie?
I think what's significant about this topic, even to the art neophyte, is it's about a widespread crime. So that's always fun to hear about. It's always interesting to learn about. You assume you live in a world of law and order and right and wrong, and even having been a journalist and filmmaker for a long time now, I'm still kind of shocked to discover the chicanery that goes on, and the kind of second guessing of all sorts of aspects of society that is really constantly necessary to guard against misinformation of all kinds. And I think that the story of this fascinating, albeit dark and disturbing, and also kind of funny at times, story, because it's full of crazy characters in and around this art fraud, is a great reminder that you always have to, second guess everything in life.
Yes, many layers, many characters. I enjoyed it very much. Jamie, great to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much.
Well, Jamie's documentary was one of our TVO originals. You can find the full story on our TVO Docs YouTube page. So how do you know if that precious painting on your wall is authentic? Jonathan Sommer is the CEO of Art Experts Canada, which looks into questionable pieces. He's also a lawyer who regularly represents victims of art fraud. Jonathan, great to have you on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
So why is it so difficult to figure out who painted a piece of art?
I mean, there are so many factors that are at play. I think the first factor, and the most important one, is that people who are collectors of art invariably want their pieces to be real, even if they're not. And so overcoming that psychological barrier to the truth, that's probably your first and biggest hurdle.
Yeah, so what are some of the red flags then that we can look at a piece or a painting and say, something's off about that?
Well, I think one of the things is you can always look for anachronistic materials. So anachronistic materials are materials that are used in the creation of the piece that didn't exist at the time that the piece is alleged to have been painted or created. Ballpoint pen writings when ballpoint pens didn't exist yet, for example, or paints that have chemical signatures that are for paints that were only created years after.
Was there a smoking gun in the Morrisseau case in your mind?
Yes, I mean there's one smoking gun, and that is that in some of the works that were found to be fakes, when scans were done, penetrating scans that looked through the paint, what they found under the paint was penciled drawings. We call those underdrawings, and they're normal in an artwork. But these underdrawings were a little different because they had the lines, but they also had the words naming the colors that were supposed to be put in a kind of paint by numbers scheme. And the writing, the handwriting, was not in Norval's hand. It was the writing of one of the forgers.
Wow, so you really have to look beneath the surface of a lot of these, of what you see, right? What you just see on the wall. I think even beyond the Morrisseau case, I wonder about how often art fraud is about fake documents or fake backstories, even beyond the painting itself.
Right. We call that provenance. And so provenance is simply the documented history of an artwork, where it was between the artist's hand and then where it ended up. And you can document provenance in all kinds of ways. You can have sales receipts, you can have photographs of the artwork, say on somebody's wall. All of this fits into evidencing the provenance of the artwork. But there's cases in Europe, for example, where forgers went so far as to infiltrate archives and replace materials in archives with forged materials, so that when other honest researchers went in to look to see whether a particular artwork was real or not, they would find these forged works, and that would corroborate the authenticity of the artworks they were looking into. And so it was incredibly elaborate efforts to do that.
Jonathan, I think the stereotype here is that this is a rich person's problem. Talk to me about who's being scammed here that we may not think about.
I mean, you're correct in that there's a kind of myth, I call it the myth of the charming rogue. And it's the idea that there's some, charming rogue who roams around and he, robs, he fools wealthy people who have more money than they know what to do with and little sense. And that, he just goes around and rips them off, and it's all very funny and nobody's hurt. That may be the case in some art frauds, and certainly that does occur. But with the Morrisseau fraud, I think one thing that we saw was that, first of all, many of the victims, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of victims of this, many of them are middle-class people who don't have a lot of disposable income, but they really wanted some special piece to have on their wall. So it was a big investment for them.
I also wonder about, the public spending side of this, because when I walk into government buildings, whether provincial, federal, there's beautiful pieces of art that represent Canada. And we paid for that. I mean, all of us paid for that.
Well, I can tell you, I see that side of it. And, we've had to work to remove works from prominent galleries, museums, universities, and government buildings, both provincial and federal. And so this stuff infiltrates everything.
We've been talking a lot about physical paintings, but we live in a digital world, Jonathan, where an AI prompt can recreate an artist's work. How does that change the game?
It changes the game in a couple of ways. If you're talking about traditional artworks, physical artworks, it's one you can create a fake, like you say, using an AI in the style of a particular artist. You would have to then reproduce that in some physical form for it to use that. But that could be done, right? And now there's the development. Some people are developing robots that are controlled by AIs, and they will be designed to create new in the style of or copies of works.
Wow. Jonathan, is there anything we can do to stop this? Or is this a lost cause in some ways?
I don't think it's a lost cause. I've been making efforts. I gave a presentation at the Canadian Senate a few years ago where I proposed a registration system that would be administered by the federal government, kind of like copyrights or trademarks. And through the system, artists and their estates could voluntarily register artworks, and there would be a whole authentication system, et cetera. But that would allow there to be a kind of control list of what was authentic and what isn't. People would be incentivized to put their works in there so that in the future they wouldn't have copying problems, and you'd be able to compare future works to the works in the database. And if they weren't there, well, that would raise questions.
Right. Yeah, it does seem like something we need. Jonathan, great to have your expertise on the program.
Oh, you're welcome.
Well, still to come, how this kind of fraud impacts Canada's art community. But for Reality Check, we are switching it up this week. Producer Charlie Buckley hits the road to find out about a lesser-known target for forgeries and fakes.
You've heard of elaborate fakes of famous paintings, but there's something that you see every day that might not be what it seems. Of all things, it's counterfeit license plates.
I've seen plates sell for as high as $50,000. There are known fakes of those ultra-rare types.
There are millions of cars on Canadian roads today, each with a government-issued plate that sets them apart from the rest. Just like with rare coins, stamps, or decorative spoons, there's actually a big market for collectors, and wherever money goes, scammers aren't far behind.
Sometimes they're flat when they should be embossed. Sometimes the color of the paint is incorrect. In Ontario, for example, they don't use every letter of the alphabet in standard plates. So if you see a regular blue and white plate driving around that has the letter Q or I or U, none of those are in the standard sequence. We're talking about the number 0 that's altered into the number 8.
Meet Ethan Kraft, better known online as the license plate guy. For his 500,000 TikTok followers, he seems to be the go-to expert on rare plates from around the world. And speaking as his friend and former college roommate, I can confirm his collection numbers in the thousands.
The deception can pose a very real threat, whether you're talking about sovereign citizens using fake license plates, people avoiding toll cameras.
Recently, police linked counterfeit plates to more than 30 criminal investigations across Ontario alone. If there's one thing we've learned this season, it's that there's nothing in this world that misinfo doesn't touch.
So be on the lookout, but keep your eyes on the road.
Well, let's go back to our conversation on art fraud and how it impacts artists and their underlying message. Sara Angel is the founder of Art Canada Institute. Its motto is to make Canadian art history a contemporary conversation. Sara, great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sara, it's always a contemporary conversation when we're talking about theft that's happening right now. Talk to me about what artists lose when their work is forged or faked.
I think they lose a sense of themselves. I think they lose part of their reputation. I think that they also lose a financial security, because what ends up happening is seeds of doubt are sown into what is real and what's not real. And imagine if you were going out to purchase something, whether it was a piece of art or whether it's a piece of jewelry, it was a car. If all of a sudden you're thinking, I don't know, maybe this isn't real, but maybe this other work is real, you're going to go for the one that you feel is more of a sure bet. And nobody wants to feel like they're picking up something that's potentially very expensive and then not real.
You talk to so many artists out there. I mean, how did they feel when this happens to them?
It's devastating. There is a doubt that's being put out there. I will say that right now, most artists who are living artists aren't experiencing forgery. It tends to happen more with artists who are already deceased. And part of the reason is because there's nobody there to speak up. However, there is, in a way, somebody to speak up, and that is the artist estate. So in the case of Norval Morrisseau, for instance, it was the artist estate who can speak out. But what those representatives of the artist feel is a real lack of themselves and a real sense of violence against the person and against the work of art. And in a way, it's just a complete colossal mind bender to try to work around how do you start proving what is real and what is not real.
Sara, is there a better way then to protect an artist's work in your mind?
Theoretically, but it is not necessarily always done, or it is rarely done. We now have a technology in place that we could essentially put barcodes or use technology to start to document artwork so that people would know where it's come from, where it has been, etc. However, that we're talking about technology that's 2026. Most artwork is works that have been done in the past, and therefore it's tricky to start to go back in time. On top of that, really, really expensive to start to put that technology into works from the past.
How important then is art education when it comes to finding out what's real, so people are really not misled here?
I think art education is really the key thing in terms of trying to avoid art fakes, art frauds. And one of the reasons I believe that Norval Morrisseau's work has been forged so widely is because he's a relatively new artist. In terms of understanding Indigenous art with a lot of scholarship that is attached to it, a lot of art history knowledge, a lot of knowing about the market, etc. That's a relatively new thing. And so that means it's not being taught in great details in classrooms and universities, etc. And until that scholarship is really established, that's one of the reasons that there can be more forgery, that it can be out there. It's just a lack of education.
Okay, so you want to see children interacting with the provenance, talking about the pieces, looking at the paint, looking at the brushstrokes, and having these conversations so that as they grow up, they know what to watch for themselves.
I would love that. I would love for artists' names and Canadian artists to be household names. And I think that is a first step. I think that I'm, of course, in the business of art education. And I think the more we understand terms like provenance, in terms of more we understand what art forgery is, the sooner we'll come around to understanding how forged works can be considered a great crime.
Sara, great to have you on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Not sure who to trust in a world of misinformation? Come to Big If True. Find us on Instagram and YouTube. Visit our website for extra content. Email us to get your thoughts on the show.
Great art speaks without words. A simple brushstroke can evoke fear, a vibrant color palette can brighten your mood, and a poignant symbol can embody a cultural moment. When that gift is stolen with a forgery or a fake, it impacts us all. I'm Molly Thomas. This is Big If True. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next Sunday or anytime online.